Let's start off with items of interest from commissioners. Are there any of those you'd like to share? None yet? I will share one. I am helping plan the Build Small, Live Large Summit. We do this every other year in Portland, and it'll be at PSU on November 7th all day long. We've got so it'll be a chance to learn about local initiatives and initiatives in Oregon, Washington, and California. And if people are interested in accessory dwelling units, cottage clusters, infill housing, state legislation, it'll all be there. Sign up if you like. Any other notes? Then let's go to the director's report.
Good afternoon. It'll be a short report today, just a couple of things to share. One, that we had our Better Housing by Design work session before council last week. The next point for that conversation at council will be our hearing on October 2nd. So I wanted to, at 3 p.m. October 2nd, wanted to encourage the commissioners to attend and also reach out to others in the community that you think are interested in the Better Housing by Design multifamily changes. I encourage them to come and testify. It would be great to have a broad representation of interest there.
Do you mind saying again what time and?
October 2nd at 3 p.m. at council for the hearing on Better Housing by Design. And then the other item is just to encourage you all. The climate strike is happening on Friday at 10:30. Students, young people are organizing, and they've encouraged adults to come as well. So we are all invited to join them in their call to action for more action on climate in Portland. That's it.
Sorry, on the Better Housing by Design, will Kat be presenting on behalf of the PSC?
I believe Kat will be presenting, yes.
Okay. All right, consent agenda. We have consideration of the minutes from August 27th. Would someone like to move their adoption? Steph moves, second?
Second.
Okay. Any concerns? Do I have to say all in favor? Yes, all in favor? Aye. All right, all opposed? That passes. Thank you for the practice. Then let's start off here with the Planning for Racial Equity. We've got Alan Lazo. Andrew, you part of this as well? And Gina.
Great. I'll go ahead and kick it off and then hand it over to Alan. We really appreciate the opportunity today. Both Alan Lazo from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon joining us, and also Jenna Hughes from our team joining us to hear more and learn more about how we apply racial equity to our work and to planning. As part of this training, we will also hear more about Portland's own zoning and land use policies of the past that have contributed to an exclusionary neighborhood patterns, loss of wealth creating opportunities, and market-driven as well as public-driven displacement. These impacts have had a significant and negative impact on communities of color throughout our city, today and before. I'd like to really commend BPS staff Jenna Hughes for taking the lead on this important research and the summation of the racist history of planning policies in Portland. She worked closely with a number of her colleagues at BPS to develop this paper that that we've published today on the website, and we'll hear about more today. We're also grateful to our external partners and other bureaus for their research, input, and evaluation of this report, including Senator Avell Gordley, Cameron Harrington from Living Coley, Alan Lazo from the Fair Housing Council for Oregon, Felicia Tripp from the Portland Leadership Foundation, and Kim McCarty from the Portland Housing Bureau. This research is important because it's, in order to move forward, a vision for a prosperous, healthy, resilient, and equitable city. We need to understand and confront the historical, systemic, and institutional racism that have created deep racial inequities that continue to harm Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color. For BPS, that means understanding how land use and planning policies have impacted our community today and how we address racial equity in our work. In this week's Street Roots edition, which I brought here and I'll pass along, there's an interview with Representative Blumenauer describing the research and learning he's doing now on how the national housing crisis is rooted in systemic racism, from redlining and sundown laws to the exclusion of African American vets in programs to access housing and education. He's released a new report called Locked Out, Reversing Federal Housing Failures and Unlocking Opportunity. I bring this up for two reasons. One, first, to acknowledge that many of us are still learning about the racist impacts of past decisions and how we are still seeing those impacts today. And secondly, to suggest that if you want to learn more about the racist history impact on housing policy, Blumenauer's new report will be another resource to check out. As we make this commitment to ensure that the planning and sustainability we are doing is also improving racial outcomes for the city, it also means that we need to identify clearly who benefits, who is harmed, and who is involved in making those decisions. And that is where the Planning and Sustainability Commission can really play a role. So I look forward to this conversation today and the continued learning, and I'm going to turn it to Alan.
Thank you, Director Durbin. And I'm going to move around a little bit. I know this will be a little unusual in this room, but we're going to have some time together. We're going to work in small groups, do some interactive things, and so hopefully this our setup won't be too much of a barrier for us. So we'll work as best we can. So again, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited about having this opportunity to have a conversation with members of the Planning and Sustainability Commission about this work that we've done around looking at the common values that we share as a community, really exploring the shared history that Jenna has so adeptly captured in her report, and then really spend some time as a group talking about our way forward, both as a commission and also as a community. And so, in addition to the agenda you have for your meeting today, I put together an agenda for our work together as a group, just to give you a sense of where we're headed, and so you can look at that. And again, it really reflects the learning objectives that we have around this workshop, this discussion that we're bringing forward today. So really the first piece we're going to talk about is identifying the shared values that we have as a community as we're working together. We're going to also look at recognizing the role that intentionally exclusionary practices and decisions from the past continue to impact the disparities that we have in our communities today, and how that is differentiated from individual choice, from individual biases. We're going to learn then from Jenna about the shared history we have around housing discrimination, segregation, and displacement in our community. And then we'll come back on the other side and talk a little bit more about understanding how that shared history has continued to impact those local communities around us today. And finally, as a group, we'll be able to talk about and apply the intersection of this history, our values, and these impacts on the current land use policy decision-making work that you all are so intimately involved in the work that you do. So that's where we're headed over the next about 2.5 hours or so. And again, we'll do our best to kind of move around without throwing off the camera folks and our national TV audience. So on the back side of the agenda that I passed out to you, I also wanted to bring forward some agreements about the way we work together today. So these are fairly common agreements that we have when we are talking about this kind of work, especially in a group setting. Some of this work that we're going to approach today can be emotional, it can be difficult, and sometimes can be difficult to work through as a group. So I want to make sure that we have some agreements that we're working with together. So the first is, it's a small group today, but we are in a large room. So I just want to ask folks to, as best as they can, to be present and stay engaged with the work that we're doing today, and engage as you're able in these conversations. Again, everyone is at a different level of understanding about the work that we're going to do, and so please engage as you're able to. We also want to make a space for folks to be able to speak their truth and expect that others might have a different truth, a different perspective than yours, and we want to respect that we have space for all of that here in this room, and that's all part of how we're going to learn together today. I want to make sure that folks are listening with the intent to understand and seek understanding beyond words. That doesn't always happen in this room. I've been on this side of the table and have come to not do that, but have come to debate and make my point, and so it doesn't always happen. And I think today is a space where we can do that and do that kind of work that is a little bit different than we very often aren't doing here. We are going to have time today for questions, discussions. So again, we want to ask those questions from a place of curiosity and set aside judgments and set aside agendas. Today, we're not making any decisions. We're not voting about anything. So again, it's a space where we can really explore how we do our work around this racial equity together. Again, these are issues that for which we might experience some discomfort some of the history that Director Durbin talked about, that Jenna captured in her report, is difficult for us to accept. It's difficult to accept the role that we continue to play in that today and the role that it had in shaping our community. So we want folks to come out from behind yourselves to make a very real conversation this afternoon. And that's really important. I think that we want to find a space that allows us to really explore what these concepts mean to the work that you all are doing. Conversely, unfortunately, it also means that we need to expect and accept that we're going to have non-closure around these issues, that this is work that will continue for you as individuals, as a commission. Some of your colleagues aren't here today. Our hope is that it will continue to be a conversation that informs the work that you do throughout the time that you are together as a commission serving our communities. Also, take responsibility for yourself, own your own reactions and feelings, and allow others the dignity of their own process. So again, we're all coming from different places, and so we want to allow each other those spaces today. We all process differently also, so please give space to silence. We might look at slowing down our conversations so that insights for people that process differently can occur in the space between the words that come out. So we'll give some space for that as we're moving through this afternoon. We'll work in a couple of different ways that allow us to process in a few different ways today. One of the things I like is, I actually talk about it a lot when I'm out working, is assume good intent, which means that I think that as a group today, again, it helps us to work together if we assume that each of us is coming from a place of having good intent, that we are sharing common values about the work we're doing, about where we're headed, but we also want to make sure we're attending to those impacts that we might create in this room rather than being defensive. If somebody points out to you that you may not have had an intent to harm me, but you did, the impact on me is harm, then you might be curious about that harm rather than defensive about having caused that impact. Lastly, this is a mechanical one. If we could ask you to manage your electronic devices and side conversations so that we show respect for folks that are presenting here and all of you that are taking the time this afternoon to participate with us. So those are the agreements that we've come up with. Is there anything else that any of you would like to bring forward in those agreements while we work together this afternoon, or any of them that seem like ones that you can't agree to? Great. All right. None being found, let's move forward. So the first thing we want to do is actually introductions. And I know that you all know each other and have been working together, but what I want to do today is give you us a chance to talk a little bit about the values we have around where we live in our community. So I'm going to ask you to see, there's 6 of us here, and I know Chris is on the phone, right, Chris?
Can you hear us, Chris?
He might have been muted. Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. We'll have you participate individually, but what I'm going to ask is by way of introduction, is for you to work in pairs, and you can work with the person just next to you. And I'm going to have you ask that individual 3 different questions, and I'm going to chart these when we come out on the other side. So what I'm going to ask you to do is ask the other person these 3 questions, write down their answers, and then when we come back to share, you will share the answer for your partner, okay? So you'll ask your partner, 1, to introduce yourself with your name, and the important part of this is the neighborhood that you currently live in. So what you're going to ask your partner is, why did you choose to live in that neighborhood originally? Why did you choose to move there? And the third question is, what is it that you love about that neighborhood today? Okay, so you can turn just to the person next to you, and those are the 3 questions. I've got them, it's appearing on your screen, and I've got them charted up here because we'll chart them, and I'll give you, we probably don't need too much more than about 5 minutes or so to have you do that. And again, on the other side, we're going to come back, and you are going to provide the answer for your partner. And Chris, you'll have to just give us your answers on your own, unfortunately. Unless you have somebody at home that you want to play the game with. So we're probably not quite halfway through, so you should be getting closer to switching to your other partner. Chris, that doesn't count you. I'm going to give you about 1 more minute if that's going to be okay. So, Chris, you're going to have to start winding up your conversation. All right. If I could ask you to wrap up your conversations, we'll go through the report out. And again, what I'm going to have you do is, as we go around, if you can introduce your partner by giving their name and telling us the neighborhood they live in. And again, I'll remind you that we're on national TV, and so if you don't want NIMBYs and YIMBYs from across the country showing up at your door. You might not give us too many specifics, but again, what neighborhood you live in, and then we'll talk through the other questions. I'm going to move over to these charts, and so that might throw off our TV folks a little bit. And I won't be talking much, so I probably don't need a mic. But I'll chart out what the answers are, and so if we could, actually, Chris, do you want to start with the 3 questions?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay. Let me get over to the board, and then why don't you start out by telling us your name and the neighborhood that you currently live in.
Sure, Chris Smith, and I live in Northwest Portland.
And then tell us why you originally moved into that neighborhood.
So I was attracted to the neighborhood because it was walkable. That was one of the criteria I was looking for. I was moving in from the suburbs in Beaverton into the city, looking forward to a walkable neighborhood. But it still offered good freeway access to commute to my job, which was in a different suburb.
Great, thank you. And what is it that you love about your neighborhood today?
Well, today it's even more walkable. I live basically on what was the northwestern edge of the neighborhood, bordering on an industrial area when I moved in. And that industrial area is now a bigger and denser part of my neighborhood, so I have even more places to walk to. And since I gave up my car and started telecommuting, I no longer worry about the freeway access.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so hopefully you can see us at home because we're just going to go around now and have folks answer those same questions. So do you want to start down there with Director Durbin?
Absolutely. This is Commissioner Steph Routh. Steph lives in Lentz. She originally moved to pick that neighborhood because she could afford a house, and it is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the state. It is also near parks, a library, and has good bicycling access. And what she loves about our neighborhood today is that the Portland Pickles play at the park a couple of blocks away from her house, as well as kids' soccer games.
Well, hopefully it won't be the last.
Great, thank you.
This is Director Andrea Durbin. She moved 13 years ago from Brussels to the Hollywood neighborhood, wooed here by her parents, and originally moved into the neighborhood because it was walkable and because it had access to schools like Beverly Cleary and Grant. And she loves about the neighborhood that it's near the Hollywood Library, which is an amazing library, and it is walkable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner Eli Spivak. He lives in Cully. He originally chose to move to Cully because he believes in co-housing, and that was a place where he could do that successfully. And he also had room to create community there and have a shared garden because his wife loves gardening. He also loved that it's biking distance from downtown Portland. Well, that's why he moved there originally. It's the wrong one. Yeah. And then what he loves about it now is the fact that it's informal, that there are a lot of rule breakers who live in his community, and that it's very diverse, and it has some of the most diverse public schools, and that it was a place where he could continue the mission-based work that he does as a developer who does co-housing. So he loves that it's a place where his values and his missions can come to tilts, and he can do both. He can exercise both. He also really loves that there is a mix of older Portland residents with newcomers, either people who have lived in different neighborhoods and or who have recently relocated.
All right, this is Commissioner Akasha Lawrence Spence. Moved to Portland from New York City to the Northwest Alphabet District, which is extremely walkable, a key criteria, and an opportunity to be near a grocery store, a park, and people living in density, people living on top of each other nearby, getting to know the neighbors was sort of a lure to that part of the town. What she loves about Northwest Portland is, in addition to those things, getting to know the local business owners. Cooch Park, wonderfully renovated park right nearby. It's well lit, unlike some of the, lower density parts of the city where it can be kind of dark streets. So it's a safety perception. That's important. A mix of old and new buildings. The fact that there's opportunity and there's space for more development and density than there is today. And it's sort of a place where people show up first to Portland. A lot of times people show up to Portland and land in Northwest Portland, and maybe they stay there, as Akasha has, or maybe they go somewhere else, but new people are coming there.
Great. Thank you, Eli.
This is Commissioner Katie Larcel. She lives in the Argay neighborhood and chose it for a number of reasons. Her parents live in Troutdale, was looking for something relatively close, although initially tried to look somewhere else and wasn't affordable. So affordability was one of the criteria. And it sounds like she got lured by a very nice day that offered a great view of Mount St. Helens. I think he liked the natural configuration of the place, kind of a gentle slope towards the Columbia. It's got east winds from the gorge, so a pretty unique microclimate, and it's somewhat connected to nature, even though it's a kind of a 60s type of neighborhood. About the neighborhood today, she's very involved in the community. She had been through school board, East Portland Action Plan, church, and basically likes the fact that it's a very mixed and diverse neighborhood and not fussy, quote unquote. Very informal.
Thank you. Might need your mic, Commissioner.
Oh. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ben Bortolazzo. And he lives in Woodstock. And he picked it because it was a really great mix of affordability and livability. And what he likes about his neighborhood is he likes the variety in it, both in terms of the architecture and also the people. And we both agreed about we both were kind of agreeing about the unfussiness of our neighborhoods and how we like that about them. And he's also noticed that his particular neighborhood now has a lot of young families in it. And when he first moved in, 10 years ago, it didn't have that. So that's what he liked.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I've had the opportunity to lead this workshop and to do this particular exercise in a number of different places, and I'm really amazed by what gets up on the board and what doesn't. One of the things I first noticed about this, and I've done it with crowds as large as 30 people, is that the first board is so diverse. So I've been in a room with 30 people and only 2 or 3 of the neighborhoods were the same, which was really amazing to me. But it does point out how different experiences we do have, or that we can have, for people that do share a common interest in working on this commission, that we actually are from very diverse places in this city. And then as we move through to talk about these other pieces about what attracts us to neighborhoods and what we continue to love about our neighborhoods today, we tend to find some commonalities from folks. right? One of the things we do tend to see is around affordability, something that tends to be disappearing in some of our neighborhoods. And in some cases, we're not affording that opportunity to those folks who are the newcomers into our communities. And then just amenities and livability, I think, attract us and continue to keep us in our neighborhoods. And so I think it's really interesting to me to see the kinds of commonalities that we have around diversity, around walkable neighborhoods, that it was, to welcoming those newcomers that come into our neighborhood. And so I think these are the kinds of values that we really need to make sure we continue to hold as we're doing work around creating the communities that we're creating. In our work, we like to refer to them as inclusive communities, and I think we haven't always had a history, a way of creating communities that has fostered those values. Anything else that folks wanted to bring up just in that first part of the introduction before we move on? Great. Okay. Any agreement or disagreement about having some common values about how what it is about our communities that keep us here, bring us here, or otherwise? Great. Okay.
Well, I thought it was kind of interesting how many people mentioned bicycling.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of neat. Actually.
Yeah, I think so, and a little unsurprising in our town, but it is neat, and even for again, as diverse from the areas that we are. I have to tell you that I'm going to tell you next a little bit about me, but I did grow up in East Portland, and I'm not sure I would put east winds on my things I either attracted me or love about my community. I think I moved out of East Portland because of that.
I said that because I just like the way it sits there. You feel like you're connected to the whole region because the Columbia is coming through and there's the winds coming out of the gorge. It was kind of more a poetic consideration.
Well, Commissioner, we'll ask you about that in February. So I will. Let me move into talking a little bit about me. So this is actually me. I'm on the right. This is the house I grew up. I grew up on 172nd in East Portland. So in an area that when I grew up there was unincorporated Multnomah County, right? It wasn't Portland, it wasn't Gresham. At the time I moved out there and my family moved out there, this was the suburbs, right? This was way out there in East Portland. And I've lived most of my life out in East Portland. My wife and I now live in the Cully neighborhood. It's the first time I've lived west of 82nd Avenue. So I spent most of my time out there. The other work that I've done out there, I was a part of my neighborhood association. I was a leader in the neighborhood association. And for folks that know the work that I do now, it might be surprising to know that there was a period when I was working in the neighborhood association where I did things like oppose Section 8 housing that was coming in across down the block from my house. And I have to admit that it was also at a time when I had no idea what Section 8 housing was. That I thought it was something bad, and that through the work that I did, the colleagues I had in neighborhood associations, that it was something that I knew that we didn't think would improve our neighborhood. So again, the work that I've started to do now around and learning about the dynamics around housing discrimination, segregation, and displacement are what really changed the view I have about how our communities develop. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. As I said, I live now with my wife closer in Northeast Portland in the Cully neighborhood. And we chose to live there for a lot of the same reasons that you did. We wanted to be closer to the city and closer to our friends who lived closer in the city, right? We literally drew like a 2-mile radius circle on a map that said, here's where all our friends live. We can't get any of them to drive out to Gresham, so we're going to move into one of these neighborhoods, and ultimately had to decide on a neighborhood in which we could afford to live in that circle. And today what we love about our neighborhood, like a lot of folks, is how close to amenities it is. We don't always take advantage of walking to them, but they are very close. We can walk to the grocery store, we can get on our bikes and go down the street and have dinner, or go out for a drink. And so we really do love those kind of amenities here. So again, I think that we start out this way by talking about where it is we live, those values we hold about the places that we love today, and let it inform the work that we do together about how we create our communities today. All right, the other thing that I would recognize about the story I told you about the work, about where the journey I have been on. So the other thing I didn't tell you is that I was actually also on the City of Gresham Planning Commission while I was living in the City of Gresham. And it was actually during that time that I had a pretty major change of heart about the way I viewed community development. And here's actually a plug for the work I do now. It was actually by taking the Fair Housing Council of Oregon's bus tour of the history of housing discrimination, segregation, and displacement that I really started to understand the levels of institutional discrimination, systemic discrimination, and implicit bias in systems that really impacted disparities today that I had no idea about. So here I was, a member of the City of Gresham's Planning Commission, working on community development issues without an understanding of why we were starting to see the displacement of the Black community out to East Portland, out to Gresham. And so it really changed my understanding about what my individual implicit biases were and how I was proceeding, and the work that I could do to change institutional, systemic, implicit bias. And so the graphic you see now kind of highlights those differences, right? When we talk about discrimination, there are different types that we're talking about. I won't read the whole example to you. Folks may be familiar with some of this work, but if you take a look at it, it talks about the difference between individual and institutional, and the difference between implicit and explicit. In the work I do around fair housing, certainly our hope is that we are much more easily rooting out the explicit discrimination that we see either at the individual or institutional level. Much harder to do is root out and change the implicit biases, the implicit discrimination that has as much impact on the disparities in community today as explicit discrimination. And at your level, what we're really talking about is institutional or systemic and implicit biases or discrimination that can happen in policies that we create, policies that we uphold, or that we continue to perpetuate. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think one of the things that the bus tour did for me, I also put in a plug for the Build Large, Live Small conference, because we are conducting a bus tour as part of that conference. So there's an opportunity to get on the bus tour if you attend that conference in November, which isn't very often.
I'll volunteer. Richard Rothstein is keynoting that conference too, who wrote The Color of Law.
Perfect. That's a spoiler alert, because Richard Rothstein also set me on the current journey that I am on now, having spoken about this for the last year and a half. But that institutional and systemic piece is what we're going to focus on in the work that you all are doing together. Okay? So as we work on that institutional, systemic discrimination or biases, we really need to make sure that we ground this conversation in the presentation that Jenna is going to provide us with, and it really talks about how is it that we got here where we are. Right? And then we can move forward from there. But I don't think we can have that conversation without understanding how it is we got here. And frankly, I don't think we can have this conversation about how we got here until we have this conversation about where here is. That we really need to start defining where it is here is. And one of the ways I do that, if you look at the graphic, there was this interesting study that I found that was done by some researchers at Yale, that talked about the differences between white Americans and Black Americans. And the part that's most interesting to me is what the headlines here talks about, the wealth gap. And what the headline says, it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, it says, whites have a huge wealth edge over Blacks, but they don't know it. So what this asked about was first about, the top one is about average income. So how much average income does a white family make over the average Black family? The second one, though, asks about wealth accumulation. So wealth is the difference between what you own and what you owe. So that's the real question here is, for every $100 in wealth accumulated by an average white family, how much wealth has the average Black family accumulated? So for every $100 in wealth that a white family has. They ask you if there's 5 different selections there, and we're not going to quiz you on this, but if you can just think to yourself what your answer might be, and you might know the answer to this, but there's still a surprise in this study. Is it $0 to $25 for every $100 that a black family has for a white family? 26 to 50, 51 to 75, 76 to 100, or 100 or more? Do black families have more accumulated wealth than white families? So let you think about that for just 1 second. What these researchers found was that 2 things. Actually, 1 thing, I guess. So the reality is that black families have about $11 of accumulated wealth for every $100 that white families do. The piece to me that was really informative, and again, the way the headline reads is the big piece in this is the gap between perception and reality. That those in the study thought that blacks had about $83 of accumulated wealth to $100 of white family wealth. And one of the pieces that was interesting to me as a person in the fair housing movement was one of the things they attributed it to was segregation in our country. That our country is so racially segregated that we have the inability to understand the impact on other communities. That many of us believe that everyone else is having the same experience that I am. That my family had an opportunity to buy a home, so everybody else has. And frankly, we talk about it in the context of home because the majority of accumulated wealth is built in home equity, the ability to buy a home, have it increase in value, either sell that home, borrow against it, send your kids to college, start a small business, buy a second home that you rent. All of those things are generated by accumulated wealth. And so there's a large portion of this country that doesn't understand that that's where we are as a country. And it's rooted directly in how we got here. And so with that, I think I am ready to pass it over to Jenna.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you, Andrea, for introducing the work. My name is Jenna Hughes. I work for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And this past year, I did a lot of research on the history of racist planning practices in Portland, in particular, what our Bureau has done in terms of zoning and land use decisions. And I did write a report, which you all should have seen by now. So this is more of a condensed version of that history. And the important takeaway is that the work that we have done has led to racial segregation and inequities regardless of intent. This timeline provides a brief sections of the history I'm going to take you through today. This history goes back around 100 years. I'm going to be talking about early zoning starting in the 1900s, and then I'm going to be talking about the expansion of single-family zoning in the 1930s to 1980. And then I'll be talking about contemporary planning, in particular in the 90s, the community planning program, which we played a role in. And then I will be talking about what we're doing differently today in thinking about racial equity in planning. Early zoning, 1900 to 1930. So to start, brief overview of what zoning is. I know you all know what it is, but for those listening in the room or online, zoning is the separation of different land uses, such as residential, commercial, industrial, for good reasons, really. I mean, initially it was for public health reasons, so that you wouldn't have a factory living right next to someone's house, for example. But also during this time in the early 1900s, some cities, primarily in the southern and eastern parts of the United States, also used zoning as a way to separate people by race. And they actually had separate zones for white households and black households. However, these ordinances were overturned in the Supreme Court case Buchanan v. Worley in 1917, and that is a newspaper clipping from around that time. But many cities found workarounds to this Supreme Court decision and continued to segregate using other zoning tactics. And I would also like to note that this did not apply to private agreements, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. In 1924, the city of Portland adopted its first zoning code, and this is the original map. The yellow areas show the original single-family zones. There were only two types of residential zones at the time. Zone 1, which was single-family, and that was only in 15 of the highest quality neighborhoods. And those were created by request of the property owners in those areas. And then zone 2 was multifamily zoning, and that was zoned more broadly due to the assumption that there would be a population of 2 million by 1940, which obviously did not happen. Before the first zoning code was even adopted, racially restrictive covenants were a common practice. And these were written into the deeds of people's homes that said that people of color could not use or own the land. This is an example of a racist covenant that was found in the Laurelhurst neighborhood in 1913. It says, "Nor shall the same or any part thereof be in any manner used or occupied by Chinese, Japanese, or Negroes, except that persons of said races may be employed as servants by residents." So, explicitly racist language there. And what's interesting about this example is there's also evidence that it was used as a type of privatized zoning. This example says that this property couldn't be used for flats, apartments, stables, stores, or business or manufacturing purposes. And these types of covenants were declared unenforceable in 1948 by the Supreme Court.
Question?
Yeah.
Was that last part unenforceable also?
Sorry.
The part about not being used for flats, apartments? For example, maybe this is not a question for you, but someone. So, for example, if this deed were in place today, and the city rezoned this property to multifamily, would this property be able to be developed that way?
Yeah, this whole covenant was declared unenforceable in 1948. That's my understanding, yeah. And so there were other types of zoning from the city perspective to as public zoning.
My understanding is that some private agreements do trump local zoning. So obviously the racial part obviously is unenforceable.
Right.
But I guess I might want to look for a little more homework just to make sure the other parts.
For Portland specifically, a lot of these agreements that I read, they were set to expire in the 1930s anyway. So these were only held in place for 20, 30 years. But it could differ from place to place, and there are still racist covenants being found, or covenants found across the city. Any more questions before we move on? Okay. Around the same time, while there was this creation of exclusive white enclaves, there was also this concentration of African Americans in the Albina neighborhood in northeast Portland. And the real estate industry played a huge role in that. In 1919, realtors and bankers were prohibited from selling or giving loans to African Americans or Asians for properties in white neighborhoods. And that's, if you're looking at the presentation, the picture on the left really is from that time and talks about that code of ethics rule. And this was not removed from the code of ethics until 1956. So Albina was really the only place that African Americans could live at the time. And during World War II, jobs in the shipyards brought many more African Americans to Portland, and many of them lived in Albina and also in Vanport, which was a public housing project located near the Columbia River. However, in 1948, unfortunately, a massive flood swept away Vanport, leaving many with nowhere to go. And so, for many, Albina was the only place they could live, and so African Americans continued to move into Albina, and white residents continued to move out. By the end of the by the end of the 1950s, there were 23,000 fewer white residents and 7,000 more black residents than there had been at the beginning of the decade. Moving into the next era of racist planning is the expansion of single-family zoning, beginning in the 1930s and going all the way till the 1980s. And most covenants were set to expire around this time in the 1930s, so there was more pressure to expand single-family zoning in order to protect property values. This is Robert Moses. Many probably heard of him. He was a New York consultant who came to Portland to create the Portland Improvement Plan in 1943. And while many of his proposals were largely around freeways, he also made some recommendations around housing. And this is a quote from the plan. It says, "Excessively large areas have been zoned for apartments, occupying 40% of the total area of the city. Portland is a city of single-family homes. We are therefore of the opinion that only a very small percentage of the area of the city should be set apart for multiple dwellings." And I think that quote is really reflective of the thinking at the time, because that's really what the city had begun to do. Yeah. I was like, I don't know how to go back. Right. Another practice that the city didn't play a direct role in, but another practice that was going on was redlining. And I'm sure many have probably heard of redlining, but what we don't often talk about is the flip side of that, which is greenlining. Real quick, the Homeowners Loan Corporation had created maps, and this map is from 1937, and where they assessed different neighborhoods based on their level of desirability. And they rated them and gave them colors. Green was considered best. Blue was considered still desirable. Yellow, definitely declining. And red was considered hazardous. And one thing to note is that property or areas were redlined even if the housing was in good shape, but if the percentage of people of color was very high. And that's typically what you see is in redline areas. They're usually the most diverse areas. And this map also shows the outline of the original single-family zones from the 1920s. And as you can see, most of them fall in the green-lined and blue-lined areas, which were considered the highest quality. This is a clipping of the original assessor's notes, and this is from the Lower Albina neighborhood, which was redlined. The clarifying remarks say, "Zoned multifamily residential and business. This area constitutes Portland's melting pot and is the nearest approach to a slum district in the city. 3/4 of the Negro population of the city reside here. And in addition, there are some 300 Orientals, 1,000 Southern Europeans, and Russians." And this was given a grade of D-. On the flip side of that, this is an example from the King Heights neighborhood in the West Hills, which was greenlined. And the assessor's remarks say, "Deed restrictions expired in 1935, but is zoned single-family residential. which, with terrain and price levels, is believed to be ample protection. And this was given a grade of A+. Looking at how this manifests today, historically green-lined areas have gained drastically higher median home values compared to other areas. And you'll also see that historically red-line areas, the home values have climbed a little bit above historically yellow-lined areas, and this is likely due to gentrification in those areas, such as the Albina neighborhood. In 1959, this was really a continuation of the expansion of single-family zoning. And duplexes and apartments were outlawed in most of the city, and in large parts of North, Northeast, and Southeast Portland. And roughly 7.5 square miles had been rezoned from multifamily to single family prior to 1959. After the adoption of this code, another 6.75 square miles were rezoned to single family. And this picture is a clip directly out of the 1959 zoning code that shows the R10 really low density, one family residential zone. And I included it because I think it's really reflective of the types of 1950s heteronormative ideals. Zooming out a little bit to talk about the national context, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was adopted, and this prohibited discrimination in housing based on federally protected classes such as race, color, religion, country of origin, and later sex, familial status, and disability. And in 1977, the Community Reinvestment Act was also enacted, which said that banks must provide credit assistance to all neighborhoods, especially those historically affected by redlining. However, banks still continued to segregate in those areas. And I think the key takeaway is that while there were these national efforts to help undo some of this past harm, discrimination and segregation still continued, and local government really played a huge role in keeping that. I'm going to take a quick pause here because that was a lot and really heavy, and I think we should all take a deep breath. So if you all wouldn't mind just breathing in with me and breathing out. Okay, are we ready to keep going? Cool. While I am going to jump into the 1980s, I don't want to just skip over the 1960s and the 1970s because that was really a time when there was a lot of increased public participation in planning. And this was largely due to the 1973 Senate Bill 100, which said that we must have a comp plan and we must have community participation in planning. And during this time, a lot of neighborhood associations were being created, and there was the stopping of the Mount Hood Freeway expansion in Southeast Portland. However, the voice and needs of people of color were still not prioritized, and that's really the key message. The population strategy was a document that really guided our 1980 comprehensive plan. And what this was is this was a policy justification for prioritizing employed, middle-class, educated people with children in order to reverse white flight trends and bring people back from the suburbs to the city. And so it considered housing types and neighborhood character that were attractive to these priority populations at the expense of others. And if any of you have seen this document before, maybe you haven't, but there's also an alternate strategy in the document that is called the social service strategy, and that was aimed at targeting resources where there were the greatest disparities. But in the end, the city didn't go with that strategy because it was considered too costly and ineffective. So they went with this one. And I want to read this quote that is from the document. This was the problem statement. It says, increasingly, the city is becoming a community of extremes, populated by the young and the old, the lower income and unemployed, minorities, and renters. I always have to take a deep breath after that because that just feels so personal to me. But this was, again, really guided the work that we did here at the city. I mentioned that single-family zoning continued to be expanded until the 1980s. This is a map of inner Southeast Portland from 1979 before the adoption of our 1980 comp plan. And it shows that the areas of Buckman, Sunnyside, Kearns neighborhood, and you may even recognize Ladd's Addition, was zoned A 2.5 or A1, A standing for apartments. And so really this area of the city allowed duplexes and apartments up until the adoption of the comp plan in January 1981. And after the adoption of the comp plan, density was instead concentrated into what they called nodes and noodles, which are higher traffic corridors and urban centers. After the comp plan, the 1990s were really the first time that the city started to roll back previous single-family zoning and instead expand multifamily zoning. And so the community planning program, the city was divided into 8 areas of the city, and the idea was to stagger the plans and start increasing density gradually across the whole city. So the city created the Central City Plan first, and then the Albina Community Plan, then the Outer Southeast Plan, then Southwest, and the city began the Inner Southeast Community Plan, but ultimately didn't finish it, and later switched to area planning because the Southwest Community Plan was so controversial and there was so much community pushback that the city just ended the entire program. And so Northwest, the peninsula, and Northeast never got finished either. Looking at a couple of the completed plans and the disparate treatment of Albina versus Southwest. Albina, as you know, was a very diverse part of the city, and the city increased density along Vancouver Williams and Interstate. But when the city tried to do the same thing in Southwest, the community pushed back and the city left a lot of the single-family zoning preserved and didn't really increase density much except along Barber Boulevard. Since 2000, there have been about 8,500 new housing units built in the Albina Community Plan area, and only about 4,000 new units in the Southwest Plan area. And almost half of those were in the South Portland neighborhood. Later, Alan's going to talk about the Interstate Corridor Urban Renewal Area Plan, which used the Albina Community Plan as a foundation, and the city directed investments into Interstate Avenue before the yellow line, light rail line came in. And Alan will talk about the outcomes of this later. Looking at the differences in demographics of Albina versus Southwest, this is a map of census data showing the share of people of color in 1990 when these plans were being created. As you can see, Albina is much more diverse than Southwest. The darkest purple shows where the share of people of color is over 50%. And Southwest, the lightest purple shows 1.4% to 15% people of color. And so not very diverse at all. Looking into a new era of planning, racial equity in planning, which I would say is this current era. In 2008, the city created Vision PDX, which was really a time when the city started to engage community members of underrepresented groups in particular in a shared vision of Portland. And the shared community values that came up were community connectedness and distinctiveness, equity and accessibility, and sustainability. And from this came the Portland Plan from 2012, which really used equity as its foundation and established equity as a citywide priority. The quote says, "Advancing equity in Portland means improving the way the city works, starting with how the city government and its partners make decisions, invest, and engage with Portlanders and each other to measure success." In 2011, the cities of Portland, Gresham, and also Multnomah County did a regional analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And this is a federal requirement for jurisdictions for every 3 to 5 years. And they looked at fair housing complaints, demographics, mortgage data, zoning and land use policies in order to look at patterns contributing to discrimination and segregation. And a couple of the findings that I found most interesting, I included, one of them said that single-family zoning contributes to an overwhelmingly high student body at Alameda Elementary and Grant High School. And actually, as a result of this, Portland Public School District remapped the catchment areas to include more multifamily housing so that they could get a more diverse student body. And another finding was that low-income residents and communities of color are more concentrated in low-opportunity areas. So these are areas with reduced access to transit, grocery stores, sidewalks, schools, and other amenities. Looking at some of the new practices and investments that really came out of this analysis, there were a lot of efforts like Fair Housing Advocacy Committee, the annual State of Housing, preference policy for Northeast Portland, bringing back residents who have historically lived in the area. And the list goes on. But a lot of these new practices have really fallen in the Housing Bureau's wheelhouse, and with the exception of inclusionary housing, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability has not taken a lot of responsibility. A coalition of around 30 organizations called Anti-Displacement PDX were really champions in putting equity policies in our current 2035 comprehensive plan. And this is an image of the building that we're in currently, where they banner dropped "End Displacement Now." And they also included push to include a lot of our anti-displacement policies and fair housing policies, including ones that look to restoring communities impacted by past decisions and undoing past harm. In 2017, the Portland African American Leadership Forum created the People's Plan. And in there, a key policy priority for the Black community was to hold the city, county, and metro accountable for the HUD mandate to affirmatively further fair housing, by ending racial segregation from opportunity, providing community development and investment without displacement. At this point, I'm going to start looking at today and some of our current land use and demographic conditions. And then we'll be getting into outcomes. To start, again, this is a map of the original single family zones from the 1920s. If you look at the areas where there are concentrated, where there's a concentration of the white population, the yellow areas are where are the highest 2 quintiles of the white population. And a lot of it aligns pretty closely with those original single family zones. If you add in another layer, which is income, the darkest purple areas show where the percentage of the household living at 140% median family income and greater is 54% or higher. And as you can see, both income and race are very closely aligned with the single family zoning. However, the original single family zones also have very low levels of vulnerability to displacement. And vulnerability is determined by where there's a high percentage of renters, low income households, those without a 4-year degree, and people of color. And the lightest blue, again, shows where the vulnerability risk factors are only 0 to 4. And the most vulnerable areas are in East Portland. This is a map of average mortgage interest deductions. And it shows that we're subsidizing housing for higher income households with high home values, which provides them with more wealth and equity over time. The darkest color shows where the average mortgage interest deduction is $11,000 to $14,000.
Hey, Jenna, for the record, could you just clarify what that is so that people understand what a mortgage interest deduction is?
Definition?
Yes, a mortgage interest deduction is the ability to deduct the interest that you pay on your mortgage on your tax returns. And so it's a federal tax code policy that subsidizes home ownership to some degree.
I just found that important because oftentimes the knowledge isn't there for people to know that that's even available. So that can be why those people with the higher education levels and the higher rates of home ownership and the higher income even know to have their CPA deduct for that, right?
Yeah. The other piece, I used to be a tax preparer, so actually. So the other thing that happens is our tax code is it's actually a regressive deduction. So the higher your income, the greater deduction you get out of this. So it's actually regressive in this case, where those who are higher income are getting a better deduction based on this subsidy.
Clarify, is this, I mean, this is obviously a big subsidy for white people. And is this the federal one only, or is this federal plus state you're showing here? Or do you know? Because the state has a mortgage interest deduction as well.
Yeah,
which
the
we
state
tried to get rid of,
follows
but it
the
didn't
state
follow.
follows the federal deductions. Essentially, your itemized deductions on your federal return tend to be the same as your state return. So there's not a separate one; it's reflected in your state return. The state does have the opportunity, though, to decouple from that. Yeah, but it's not separate.
Well, and then there was Measure 5, right? I mean,
Is that the property tax measure?
Yeah, that was the big property, and that had a huge impact on this. It meant that all of the inner neighborhoods that had went through that big rise in property values, their property values were going up way faster than Measure 5 was allowing. The tax, I guess it's not interest deduction.
Right.
No, it's not interest,
Right.
but the amount of tax that they pay.
Right. The property tax,
Yeah,
the
it's
amount
so
that your
much
home is
lower in
assessed.
proportion to this to the amount that they that their house is worth. So that in East Portland, people are paying much more closely to what their house is worth. Where every time anybody in an inner city neighborhood, their house is worth, it goes up to $1.5 million. They're paying probably about the same as somebody in East Portland.
Right.
So
And there's
don't
a
know.
name
So
for
there's
that
a
too.
lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of inequities in the tax code.
Yeah, and I think the part that you're referring to, Commissioner, if folks can visualize it, is the Measure 5 cap allows property taxes to increase at 3% a year, barring other exceptions like improvements or sale. And so what you have is inner city homes or homes closer in that are, as their real market value accelerates like this, their assessed property values are held stable at that 3% increase. And so in East Portland, homes aren't accelerating as much, and so their real market value stays closer to their assessed value more so than homes that have a higher assessed value. And so you have this great inequity, and it is most pronounced in East Portland. You're absolutely right.
Thank you for asking that question, and thanks, Alan. I knew he could explain it way better than me. Looking at the 2018 State of Housing report, this also really highlights the disparities when it comes to home ownership. So this graph shows the home ownership rate by race and ethnicity, showing that Black, Latinx, Native American, and Pacific Islanders are trailing behind, and that the opportunities for home ownership really differ by race. This was also in the report that shows where the average Portland household could afford to buy a home in Portland without becoming cost burdened. And this is based off of a median income of $58,423. And it's only in a couple areas of the city, which are in East Portland. However, if you look at the average black household, they are completely priced out of the city. And this is based off of a median income of $26,675. So I think this is really striking to me. It's unacceptable. And we as a city and as you as commissioners, we are obligated and authorized to do better. So, go ahead.
Thanks, Jenna. I'll go back to two points here. One is if you look at this graph about home ownership and especially Black home ownership, here in Oregon, the Black home ownership rate of about 30% is effectively unchanged since 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed 51 years ago. So Black home ownership rate is the same as it was 51 years ago. It's gone up a little bit, but then we know that households of color were more impacted by the housing crisis than other home buyers and homeowners, and so Black home ownership rate is effectively unchanged in 51 years. The other thing the way I like to describe this map is that there are no neighborhoods in which the average Black household can afford to buy a home in Portland without being cost burdened. And we know again that it's notable because there's a difference by race. There are two neighborhoods in which the average Portland household, so we've already effectively locked out most of the community, but there's a difference by race. So as Jenna said, this is a material that can be difficult for folks to process at times, and so we want to go through and make sure we had some time to talk about the impacts of this history on all of you. And so we're going to do a couple things. We've got some discussion questions. First we want to talk a little bit about just what's coming up for each of you after hearing this history. And I think also the totality of this history is what strikes me sometimes. On the bus tours that we do, we hear from a lot of folks that talk about there's so many things that they didn't know that they learn about on our bus tour. And one of the things I tend to remind folks is, I think that we did know a lot of these things, but we don't get reminded of them all together like this very often. We sort of knew redlining existed, but we didn't know that it was coupled with green lining and that it led to the disparities we see in our community. So it weaves this very big picture that we have. So I want to hear from you about what's coming up for you. And then, we can start to move into talking about where we go from here. What lessons from these histories might be applied to how our city develops today. And we're going to continue to talk about that in the next part of this. So to do that, I do want to give us a little bit of processing time since we've been kind of, I'm just prattling on at you. That's, Jenna, sorry, I don't mean to say that your presentation was prattling, but we've been, together we've been talking for a long time. So I'm going to just give folks who might process a little more carefully and quietly some time to just process, and you're free to write and journal for about 5 minutes or so. And then I'll have you work together in pairs again as part of the commission, and then we'll come back on the other side of that and have a larger group discussion. So take about 5 minutes just to sit quietly and process, write if that's your style, and then we'll move into some sharing time together. Chris, you're invited to do the same.
Jenna, in defiance of the request, can I ask just a meta question?
We checked with you to see if you had any questions or comments that you wanted to bring forward that we may not have had an opportunity to do yet. And nothing about the questions we're exploring now, but just anything about the presentations so far.
One thing I was struck by that didn't come up in the conversation is that the zoning from early in the century reflected an expectation of population growth way beyond what actually occurred in the first half of the century. And I'm a little bit curious how that, obviously a need to reset may have affected some of the deliberations around zoning as things were adjusted. There's just one thing that occurred to me.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to have you join one of the small groups here by phone when we split up here, so I'll let you also bring your other comments into them. So what I want to do then again is now that we've had a chance to kind of reflect quietly for a couple minutes, is let you also reflect with one of your colleagues just privately for, again, another 5 or 10 minutes before we come back and talk about any big themes that are coming forward and what's coming up for folks. And so you don't work with the same person that you worked with the first time around. What I'll do is I'll just have Commissioner Larcell, if you want to work with Director Durbin, and then Commissioner Spivak and Marta Lazo, you can work together. And if you could, since the phone's right there, why don't you include Commissioner Smith from the phone, and then, yeah, you two work together. So again, so this is an opportunity for you just to share your thoughts about what's coming up with you, for you after hearing this history. And if you want to, I would cover that question first. And then if you want to start talking a little bit about the lessons from this history that we can apply moving forward, then we can do that. But I'm only going to give you about, 5 to 7 minutes. I'll tell you when it's halfway through so that you can make sure you switch and that the other person you're working with isn't taking up all the air. All right, go.
Chris, would you like to start off? You got me and Jen here.
Sure. So, yeah, I guess the obvious impression is the injustice of the whole thing, and probably some guilt around having been on the side of the fence that got the benefit from all these policies. And then, I want to see what your thoughts
got a couple minutes, so make sure that your other partner has a chance to share. All right, if folks could wrap up your last thoughts, then we'll come back together as a large group. All right, thank you. All right. So why don't we start with this first question about what was coming up for folks? And Chris, I know you talked a little bit originally, but again, let me just go to you first to make sure that we don't overlook you. Is there anything that you wanted to share with the folks here in the room and our national TV audience about what comes up for you after hearing the history presentation that Jenna provided?
Well, a lot of it was familiar because I've read The Color of Law, so I have some sense of how skewed all the policies were. I was sharing with my colleagues that I lived through some of the local history when the Southwest Community Plan was happening. I was on a city club committee that was studying residential density. It was interesting to watch that the neighborhood activists actually had better GIS tools than the city did and was knocking down the city arguments, which clearly wasn't happening in other neighborhoods. And that's kind of the first domino that toppled the area planning process and probably resulted in Southeast not getting their fair chance in that process. So even the recent history is pretty daunting.
Great. And did you say that was the Southwest Portland neighborhoods that had more GIS mapping than the city?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So about resources, and I think we continue to see that in some places in our city today, where some neighborhoods are better resourced, better have better education is maybe the wrong word, but better ability to participate in processes, right? That can really skew what we see as participation. So that's not new to us. Great. Okay. Thanks. Anybody else want to share? Any other commissioners want to share, or director want to share what came up for them over the history presentation?
I think more than anything else, it kind of just helped to cement my own mission and values in the work that I do, in kind of raising the banner for ownership. That over and over again, we sit on this commission dais and we hear people talk about affordable housing. And affordable housing is a Band-Aid. It does nothing, honestly. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, we're patting ourselves on the back for doing nothing, right? This is not going to improve wealth outcomes, opportunity outcomes, or anything in these communities. We have to create ownership. And until we do that, we're going to continue to have these unintended consequences that we clearly outlined that we know are going to happen if we continue down this road, right? So for me, it's just, you know, this is a point in time where we can make a 180 and we can stop putting Band-Aids on oceans. You know, I mean, these problems are more than just a century. You know, Jenna, your presentation was amazing and comprehensive, and what you sent us was great, right? Such great information, and the appendices that we can go back and read the articles and the work that you've done and dug through. But the truth is that we're not going to see any true positive outcomes until we rectify this ownership problem. And that just helped to solidify exactly what my work is and exactly what I'm doing.
Perfect. Thank you. And there's lots of different factors to that, right? I mean, some of the history we heard about that locked out home ownership opportunities, especially for the African American community, were very specific. But those disparities, as we saw in that map in the State of Housing Report, continue today. Those are legacies of that, or they are the outcomes of that legacy that continue today that you feel like we need to overcome still. Great.
I mean, I don't feel like we know, right? So
yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Commissioner Roth?
First of all, Band-Aids on oceans will be the image that I take from this conversation. That is awesome. When we were talking, I think one thing that comes up for me, and I've been thinking about it a lot, is, you know, we're talking about planning, we're talking about a new potential policy, and it's going to involve change. That the idea of that change is hard. I think we really need to sit change is hard for whom? Change is hard for people like me who, you know, for at least a good chunk of the system is working really well, and it is comfortable. And so the idea that change could make people who look like me less comfortable, and for others, if you're in a dire situation, you want change to happen as soon as possible. So I just think when we are talking about change, and we feel discomfort in it, maybe taking a step back and saying, why is this uncomfortable for me?
Thank you. You know, one of the things I'll go back to that I didn't mention when we did this exercise up front, that I didn't point out, was the purposeful word of the word choose when we talk about the neighborhoods that we chose to move into. And it's purposeful because not everybody has had that privilege, right? That we learned again in this history, and we're repeated again, that there were members of our community who did not actually have choice about where they could live in our community. And that was institutional explicit policy. We know today that there are institutional implicit policies and practices that are happening that are locking those folks out, but you know, there are members of our community who did not have the privilege to choose where they could live in our communities. So it's intentional.
And just for the record, I'd like to change that quote to Band-Aid on a deluge instead of ocean.
Still as impactful. All right. Anyone else?
Commissioner Brown? I have a few thoughts. The most helpful new information for me was that the more recent history of the attempted plan in Southwest and then in Southeast that didn't have that much of an impact or got disbanded partway through. I didn't know about that piece of the history. It makes me more interested in seeing zoning reform and remapping in the close-in areas of the city. And so I've been talking about that for a while, but I didn't realize that they had started it before and there was enough political backlash that it got pushed back. That was new to me. I think on the housing, I have a slightly different take from what Akasha shared. I think that I did affordable housing development for a long time with rental housing. And at first I thought it was like the step to get to homeownership. And sometimes it is, but with limits on income and employment, education, sometimes it's a fantastic place and people are not going to go to homeownership in some situations, and it's essential to have the rental housing. And I would say that we should have rental housing options in every neighborhood, not just in some, and we should confer fewer benefits on homeowners. So trying to level the playing field there and provide more stability for renters. And then one other thought I have coming up on our work plan is we've got design review and historic districts coming up for our commission. And I think that we should look with the perspective to make sure that those we have a strong equity lens on as well, to make sure that those don't become, intended or not, a new version of single family zoning to make it harder to do new housing in certain parts of the city.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner Spick, to your point, I think it's, it's not an either or, right? This is a both and, right? It's both rental housing and homeownership opportunities, the ability to create wealth that we need to figure out how all those pieces fit together in this.
So I think we need the Band-Aids too. Both.
Any other commissioners? Commissioner Barger?
For me, having just gone through the residential infill project, is it on?
I don't know.
I think
Go
so. The one thing that struck me was the role that single family played over the years in patterns of segregation, and how closely those patterns of redlining are still seen today, and how closely that pattern has continued over the years. It was kind of interesting to see those maps kind of overlapping with income and how that actually has been protracted over the years. So basically those very deliberate zoning practices essentially influence the racial makeup of the city. As I'm reflecting on what the lessons are here is, we talk about a lot of implicit and explicit bias in actions. I think we probably want to be a lot more thoughtful on really understanding what the direct effects are of whatever it is that we try to regulate, as well as what the indirect effects are. And it seems like the indirect can be actually just as important. Things like the displacement analysis that we started to do on some of the more recent projects, I think are starting to go in that direction. We probably need to get a lot deeper in those analysis. Another thing that really struck me, and kind of connecting to what Eli was saying about the big plans, the big community plans, is how the first one that went through was the Albina. That really rezoned a lot more comprehensively corridors, and you can see it now. It's reflected in the zoning. There's a much bigger band of high density zoning that's allowed in those corridors, whereas the later ones that were stalled, and you look at division, there's only a very narrow band. So that kind of inequity carried through, and it's very visible today. And it's kind of interesting to kind of see it and understand why. So it's very, and by the way, thank you for the great presentation. This was very useful.
Thank you, Jenna. Great, thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else that?
Yeah, I was really struck by the wealth gap, and have been for a while. And so when the RIP, residential infill program gets started in East Portland, I'm really hoping that we can have programs in place to help people hold on to their wealth and be able to build wealth there, because there's going to be wealth built. And so when I was listening, I was going, because I had actually tried to work with Robert Liberty and get a grant from Metro that would have got started to be able to do that, to start getting some programs together to really look at how you do that. And so we're going to continue to work on it, but it just seems like that's really a key, isn't it? And I agree with you about, everybody in this country should have an opportunity to build wealth.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Director Durbin?
Well, I really appreciate the kind of the summarized history over the years that's Portland specific. I think it's really helpful for us to see kind of what the long-term generational impacts are and the disparities that we're seeing and experiencing in our community today. I think it's really important to inform all of us and inform city government. And I also think it really demonstrates that we currently do not have sufficient tools and policies and practices in place to avert those kind of outcomes and address restitution and restoration and really reduce the disparities we see. I think that's part of the work that we're doing with the Anti-Displacement Action Plan, is really looking at what some of those tools will be. I think there's more work that we need to be doing around wealth creation and wealth opportunities, around jobs and job creation. So I think there's just a lot of opportunities and needs for us to kind of bring this lens to the work and really make sure that we are finding the kind of right tools and mechanisms to ensure that we're getting greater benefits and outcomes from the work that we're doing. I also think the conversation that we're having with the Planning and Sustainability Commission about how to be more accessible and open to more people in the community is an important way for us to ensure that the kinds of questions that we're understanding, the implicit and explicit biases are surfaced, right? And the more that we can be accessible and have opportunities for people in the community to come and talk to us and interact with us, we can really learn directly from the community about the kinds of questions that we may not know to ask. So I think that the work that we'll be starting to do next year and really kind of mapping out ways that the commission itself can be more interactive with community will be an important tool for us doing our work together.
Thank you. Just for the interest of time, I want to keep moving us forward. I know you had a chance to share together, and so I really appreciate the perspectives that you've brought forward. And one of the things I like about the way this whole training presentation comes together is that, you aren't plants, but it leads us right into the next piece of this, which is we quite literally had someone talk about the words unintended consequences, right? We, for so long in work that we all do, had talked about, well, that was an unintended consequence that came up, and we're willing to accept that, well, there might be unintended consequences, right? We hear that quite often when we're making decisions. And so for me, again, I think we, in addition to grounding this work, this conversation in this history that we have, can we ground it also in some examples of the ability for us to change that narrative around unintended consequences, okay? So let's go through and look at this, a couple clips. This is actually from Priced Out, if you haven't seen it, and there are really a couple of really poignant clips from this that I think can lead us into a conversation about how we talk about unintended consequences.
The city continued revitalization efforts, knowing gentrification was coming. In 2000, the PDC drew up an urban renewal district for a new light rail system that would run along the western edge of Albina.
That was the greatest concern, regularly voiced by the community members, is displacement. The city forecasted displacement. And so they said, okay, we forecast that this much displacement is going to occur. To counter that, we're going to create units of affordable housing. Priority would go to existing residents.
I think more good has been achieved than damage. If we're successful in bringing an area back to life, revitalizing it, bringing more investment, it also does create a downside in that an area becomes more desirable. People who can't afford their current rents now face an even deeper hole in trying to meet their basic needs.
If the city had built the number of affordable units they promised,
that would have prevented the mass displacement. It would have been enough.
So I love that clip. If that woman is Maxine Fitzpatrick, the recently retired executive director at Portland Community Reinvestment, Inc., who spent a good portion of her career working to bring that community back to Northeast Portland, and her vision to do that continues today. And it's so poignant to me to hear her say, it would have been enough. So there actually was an intention there. Recognize displacement, build 2,000 homes, and Maxine tells us it would have been enough. It just didn't happen. So let's look at the next clip. Oh, maybe.
Film Northeast Passage We'd seen what happened when the Boise neighborhood adopted a policy to oppose all subsidized rentals in its area.
We don't support anymore rental housing that is subsidized for people whose incomes are lower than 60% of median family income.
Our perception was that there was sufficient low-income housing to handle our needs.
I want to go on record in saying that the land use policy sounds quite racist, and I think it should be revisited. I second that.
It boils down to a racial issue. The very same houses that whites can come into the community and get, African Americans are redlined and can't get the loans from the banks.
One question you brought up earlier about being against affordable housing. Most neighborhood associations were flat out against it. Big mistake. Big mistake.
The policy was based on known facts at the time. You can only make decisions based on your reality at a time.
There's a lot of things I would do different if I had a crystal ball back then and could see today. But the problem is you don't have a crystal ball.
So it's Fred Stewart, who's a realtor in Portland. And the piece I like there is that he says that the problem is we don't have a crystal ball. And I guess what I would offer you in this next discussion is that we might. That we have seen some examples where there have been unintended consequences or promises that weren't kept, and we know what the outcomes were. We know what the outcomes will be. And so we need to commit to proceeding in a different way. And Director Durbin, you said yourself, we may not have a good enough crystal ball. We may not yet have the tools, yet we know what their potential outcomes are. So we probably need to get there to overcome those.
And one of the things that really, boggles my mind is that oftentimes developers are given subsidies to create affordable housing, right? Mm-hmm. And so was that money distributed previously, right? And where did that go, right? The problem also is accountability. We don't have the and this is a larger conversation, and I see you looking at the clock. But we don't have these feedback and accountability mechanisms to hold the private institutions accountable to the money that they're taking from us already, right? This is taxpayer money that is going to the developer to fill a need, right? And then the need isn't filled, and then there are unintended consequences.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, it looked like it said 540 and it messed me up for a second. It was the second hand. But you're right. And so in this case, in the interstate corridor where there were significant public infrastructure investments made through the Max line and a tax increment financing district was created, there were mechanisms in place that should have created that housing, and the funding didn't proceed as it should have. Absolutely. Get dedicated somewhere else. And so we had intentions, we had outcomes that we intended to meet that we didn't carry through on.
I have always wondered what happened there. I have always wondered. And I hope that we're going to, I would love to know exactly where the problem, where the mistakes were made, where the money didn't get spent, where the decision was, because that whole thing haunts me. I wasn't involved in it, but when I look at East Portland, I just see it happening again. So I'm haunted by that, and I would really like to understand that better.
Yeah.
What exactly happened?
And that might be a question that Prosper Portal can answer. I know that somebody had told me the answer once. It was actually Ryan, but now I've forgotten it completely. So then you have to ask somebody else about it. But what I will tell you is you're right. So what we can do is visually see the impacts of that broken promise in North and Northeast Portland, right? So let me just run you through a set of graphics here. The first Northeast. So this first one, so Jenna alluded to this when she talked about the Albina area and the loss of the black residents. This is the interstate corridor urban renewal area. So at its height in the 1990s, there were, you can see there 4,500 black renters and another 3,200 black homeowners. You can see the decrease between starting in 2000 and proceeding into 2016. Okay. So there, the numbers I've seen that there were roughly 10 to 14,000 black residents that were displaced out of North and Northeast Portland, and it continues to increase. In the 2020 census, we'll see an increase in that number. And again, as Maxine talks about, 2,000 units would have kept 10,000 people in that community. The other thing that's striking to me is this set of maps that actually shows us graphically what that looked like. So again, as Jenna talked about, the population, the black population, and especially lower Albina, was greater than 50% in 1970. So this proceeds through the census years 1970, 1980. You can see the displacement or the pushing north of the black community, 1990, and then 2000 and 2010. So as those colors lighten, the percentage of African Americans in these communities is decreasing. I like that set of maps because it's a visual, kind of visceral representation of what happened in North and Northeast Portland. I think some people, again, would go so far as to call that displacement unintended consequences, which again is a narrative I think we should change. And one of the ways I've talked about it is changing this narrative around unintended consequences to talking about our intent, so that our consequences match the intent that we're going in with, right? And so what it actually is having intended outcomes. So instead of unintended consequences, we have intended or intentional outcomes in the work that we're doing. And for you all, that's projects like, how can you start to reflect the shared values that we have as a community and have those outcomes reflect the intentions that you all have as part of that community, as leaders in this community. You have things like the residential infill project, the better housing by design, anti-displacement that will come in front of you, lots of Southwest Corridor planning will come in front of you, work in East Portland. So how can we start to set some intentional outcomes that really reflect those values and what your intentions are? Commissioner, did you? Okay.
I guess, I don't like the unintended consequence phrase either. And I think that a lot of times we can do a better job of figuring out what is actually going to happen. And honestly, there's a lot of room for, especially people who get displaced, to actually look at it and think maybe that was intended. And I honestly, I'm not a conspiracy theory person, but I think people can be very careless.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I don't want to have this narrative downplay the fact that there may be some intentions out there that led to these outcomes. Not at all. I think one of the things I like to recognize is that I'm not sure that any of those folks are in this room. And that's my hope. I certainly wouldn't hope that those are the intentions that any of you sitting on this commission have. And it might be worth a discussion as to whether or not we agree on what our intentions are. But that's why I use that framework, is because I don't believe that any of us actually have those kinds of intentions going into the kind of work we're doing. But what we do have are unintended consequences. That does happen because I like to believe that we have the best of intentions moving forward together in our work.
I do think, and I don't, if this is to your point, because it comes like community benefits agreement, and what is enforceable, and how to ensure that communities can feel a sense of trust that those are actually going to be, because there were, one of the things that has come up with memorandum of understanding with different communities for the Powell Division project through its evolution, as well as people go back to specifically interstate, the CBA. It's just like, well, these are the agreements that we'll do in order to make this palatable, and it's like, well, we've heard that before. And like, how can you assure, like, what is the enforcement? Well, like, what are the consequences for failure to adhere to that agreement? So I think that's kind of one of those questions. What are the enforcement mechanisms to ensure that we are building trust as well as building community wealth and reducing disparities?
Yeah, I think you got to it right there at the end. I think those are issues around trust, right, between community members who would like to believe that the folks that are in these kinds of buildings have good intentions. But certainly these past examples haven't supported that to some degree. And I think the question is, are we on a different path right now? And so I'd put to you, I guess, I mean, as a commission, do you feel like you have some agreement about at least your overall intentions? Do you feel like that's work that you all want to do more conversations about? We won't settle it tonight because we're going to move into a different piece, but I'm wondering if that's work that you all would explore further. Or do you feel pretty comfortable about working with your colleagues in a manner that is aligned?
I definitely think it's something that we should explore further, especially because we're missing a good portion of our commission tonight. And so we need to have everyone present so that we have all voices here and we are all on the same page as to the work that needs to be done.
Okay. Thank you. Any others around alignment of intentions?
Well, it's not like that I want us all to disagree, but there is a power in having a group of people that have slightly different points of view, and that are not, and that that we can be testing each other's ideas, and that has been the commission up until now. I mean, we would have tough votes and split, and would still have a lot of respect around the table. So I guess I'm not, which doesn't mean that we couldn't talk more about our intentions, but I just think that that's an important component too. We all need to, we don't want to get into a group think situation.
Sure. Thank you. Commissioner?
I don't question the genuine desire of this commission to really do what's really good for the city. I think everybody have best of intentions, at least this current one. I do, however, find a lot of benefit in understanding more about past patterns and understanding more how we got to where we are.
Yeah.
So to that extent, continuing this conversation, really perhaps frame it around intentions, but really, think big picture and really project that to the future. I think perhaps if there's anything more that we need to understand about the past, that's great, but really kind of really project that ahead. I think that could be a beneficial conversation to be had.
Great, thanks. Anyone else?
I think this is a good motivation for humility in our standpoint, because each of these decisions that you summarized for us, Jenna, there are thoughtful people who made those decisions, and some of them turned out to have some pretty harsh consequences. So it's humble for us to remember that we are making decisions, and we need to be on guard because we're thoughtful people, but we could still screw it up. So I think that's part of it. And the other part of it is that for all the highlighting past egregious examples, makes it sort of seem like that's in the past, but now we're at a good starting point. But I think it's also, we should recognize that in some places the current status quo ain't so hot.
Yeah.
In terms of land use rules, Title 33, and that we should also sort of think that just because it's easy to think that the problems are all in the past and we finally have a clean slate to start up, and I would think that it would be optimistic to think that we've got a great clean slate right now.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, to recognize that those disparities, again, are that legacy of this history. I think that's why we talk about it, so that we can recognize the disparities today. That's the one point I'll make. The other point I'll make is you're right, Commissioner Spivak, about decisions that you're making today. Some of the decisions and the things that we hear about that Jenna talked about seem almost laughable to us, right? Jenna is very nice and didn't really hit the, single-family zoning was literally created to exclude blacks because they couldn't afford single-family homes, right? That's what it was used for. And it seems laughable as to that there was a point in time when that was the thinking. So, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, will you make a decision that will be in a presentation like that and people will say, wow, I can't believe we thought that way in 2019. So something to think about, because those exist, right? We can't see them today. It's the nature of equity. We can't see those things today, but 50, 60, 70 years from now, when we have outcomes like we continue to see on the ground today, we'll be like, oh yeah, it was that point back there where we turned the wrong way. So we have about 20 minutes left here, and I'm going to move us into the last part, which I think some of you have already touched on, which again is that great part about us, the way this proceeds. And it really is talking about those intended outcomes and really talking about the work that you have in front of you. And so it is kind of rising up to that big picture level and talking about what kinds of outcomes that you want to see that reflect this racial equity, that addresses this history that we have. There's two pieces. So there's that. So, what might be some of those kind of outcomes? And then what are the actions associated with that we would need to undertake to reach those outcomes? So there's two pieces. Are there some project outcomes in the work that you all either have in front of you, would like to see in front of you, or see down the road? And what are the actions that might be related to that would be necessary to undertake reaching those outcomes, those intentional outcomes? So I'll give you a couple of just moments to think about that, and then this will we'll just split you into two groups, let you work as a small group, and then we'll come back in the last about 10 minutes of that and share those out. I also want to go to the phone and make sure, Commissioner Smith, we haven't had a chance to call on you and to check and see if there's anything that you needed or wanted to bring forward.
One comment about the Interstate Urban Renewal District. I mean, part of the failure there was that there wasn't enough money to build the rail line and the housing at the same time. So the way the district was programmed, the rail line got built first, and then the money for affordable housing came later. And that's part of why we saw the displacement. And I think we've learned that lesson. This body took a pretty strong statement around Southwest Corridor. We should rethink building the rail line if we can't program the affordable housing at the front end of the project. So we are learning, maybe slowly, but we are learning.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. That does remind me that is what I have heard as an explanation also, that right, there wasn't enough money in the transportation part of the project to make sure that the affordable housing got built. And I think you see work right now around the equitable housing initiative in Southwest Corridor that is trying to reverse that. So we'll see how that turns out for us. Great. All right, so let me give you about 6-7 minutes to work in small groups, and again, talk about these two pieces where if you could think big about, this is an opportunity really to release ourselves from the constraints of possibility even, and talk about what kinds of outcomes would you like to see that really reflect this opportunity around racial equity, and then what kinds of actions would it take to get there with the commission itself. And we'll just split right down the middle, and if you folks on this side want to take Commissioner Smith into your group, that would be fantastic. Okay, we'll put Director Durbin in this group when she returns in. Yeah, okay. All right, you'll have just a couple more minutes before we come together as a large group again. All right, I know we could talk much more. I'll let you finish your last thoughts, and then we'll come together and share out as a large group before we call it an evening. Great. All right. Well, thank you. I hope that that gave you an opportunity again to do some big thinking around the work that's in front of us as a community and how we can move forward, especially in light of the information that we've heard tonight. So, are there folks that want to share out a little bit about either the outcomes that you talked about for the work that you have, or any specific actions that you might have? And I guess I'll put them on that piece of paper right there.
We discussed two of them mostly. One of them was recognizing that these policies go beyond the zoning code, have more collaboration with the Housing Bureau and with Prosper Portland. We work with the Housing Bureau some, Prosper Portland rarely. I think it came up with affordable commercial spaces is the most I can remember from the past 3.5 years. So that was one idea. The other one is one I'll beat the horse one more time, is to consider a mapping project where we think that where it may be that now that we've done a pretty thorough job of redefining what each of our zones are, single dwelling, strangely still named that. Multi-dwelling, they're more based on scale. I think it might be worth looking at where those are located and recognizing that that may be, and that we would, in doing so, be comfortable with some displacement of people who are affluent and white. And that might be part of the puzzle to meet both equity goals and also climate goals of having more people live near downtown, more attached housing, shorter trips. There might be a rezone project that would be advisable.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me just touch base on a couple on the first one. I'm assuming that, especially with PHB, is because I heard this in the discussion over RIP, is that you don't control some things like anti-displacement. All the measures that you could put in place aren't controlled by the zoning code. I mean, that's the discussion I heard at the PSC at the time, and that especially tends to have a racial equity component to it. Displacement tends to be impacting lower income Black and Latinx communities right now in our area. Is that where your thinking was going with some of those?
Yeah. So yes and no. I think it was going back to the point that, in this amazing summation, we realized that there are so many actors at play in this, the inequity and the racial wealth gap, right? And so there's no one zoning policy or coding policy that we could create that would quell all of these issues. And so we need more of a coalition to where, everyone who is a part of that coalition can affect different parts of the policy so that we get something that's more comprehensive.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to any others that had. How about the other group? Were there any either specific outcomes that you had or actions that should be taken?
We talk about housing opportunity being one. It means different things for different people, but probably more housing, more accessible housing at different price points. We noted that there's the price point that you can pay dictates where you're going to be. So the lower the income, the further out you are, and try to reverse that trend. Building wealth. And as far as actions, one of the points that we discussed was weighing in before projects start, being able to be involved in the scoping, which I think happens sometimes for this commission. And perhaps also be more participatory in the way that we hold our hearings and hold hearings in different locations other than just this, and find ways to engage a greater segment of the community.
And again, the idea being to specifically include different communities of color, communities that have been left out of those participatory processes in the past, generally. Okay, great. All right, well, we are at 5 minutes to 6, so I want to let us end there. Again, the idea for us is we have this kind of long history that has led to some disparate outcomes in our community. But you all in the positions that you are sitting in now, as well as all of us in this community, have that opportunity to seize on these values that we share, these intentions, these outcomes that we want to see in our communities. And the hope is that that's how we are able to move forward together through the work that the government is doing and the way that the community will continue to push us forward. So thank you so much for the opportunity to spend this time with you this evening and do this work. And our hope is, again, that this is the beginning of a conversation that is much longer and even more complicated than we could ever imagine, and not the end of that conversation. So thank you for having me, and again, thank you to Jenna and the work that she has done with the Bureau. So thanks this evening.
Thank you very much, Alan, and really wanted to thank you for being here today, and also wanted to acknowledge and thank Jenna for the incredible work that she has done this past year to pull this research together and help us kind of see the cumulative impact of zoning and land use policies and code in our city. I also want to just recognize that today is Jenna's last day at BPS. She is going to be leaving the city of Portland and going to the city of Beaverton. Our loss, their gain, but we have learned a lot from her. She has made a real impact in the work that BPS has been doing, and we're really grateful and wish her luck and hope that she will be back to the city of Portland.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, commissioners, for allowing me to be here and present. Thank you, Alan, for allowing me to co-facilitate, co-present with you. It's been really a pleasure to be here at the City of Portland, working at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And I hope to, keep collaborating across the different cities. I'll still be in the region, and this work will always remain important to me, and I'll always be committed to it.
Can I just say very quickly, the rest of my family lives in Beaverton, so I'm sad to see you going, and I'm really thrilled to see you going. So thank you in advance.
Come visit.
Yeah, all the time.
Food carts.
Thank you for that write-up. It will not sit on a shelf. It'll get read, I'm sure, a lot. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.